Questions, if anyone has one? Yes, sir. We ask you to identify yourself and speak into the microphone.
Luke Spies, I'm the strategic director at the New York State Dormitory Authority, but I spent 19 years in the New York State Legislature working in Ways and Means with my friend Laura England over there and others and developing public policy. One of the things that I haven't heard yet, he pointed out the change and the difficulty of certain sectors of the population that have black males between 18 and 25 who seem to be experiencing a more difficult time. And whether or not we were talking about things that happened in prior recessions that caused those folks to completely drop out of the reporting mechanism, i.e., I remember when I used to do labor, one of the things that the numbers seem to be a little skewed because after folks were unemployed for 6 months or a year, you kind of lost track of them. You never knew what happened to them and whether or not those numbers actually truly reflected what the unemployment numbers were. So if you have a 35% black male, 17 to 35 unemployment population, that number is probably more realistically somewhere on the order of 50%. And with that in mind, whether or not we're at a place now when we say we're in the Great Recession, whether or not the true solution is something sort of like what was necessary to come out of the Great Depression, WPA type of policies where you have crumbling infrastructure and being able to put these hundreds of thousands of people back in, take that human capital and put them back to work.
That's a perfect segue for my policy piece, so let me get into that. Thank you for asking that. I'm not very optimistic about the ability of the national economy to recover, and the New York State economy is not going to recover in a meaningful way without recovery at the national level. What we need to see happen, I think, is that there needs to be some policies to address the foreclosure problem, because there are a lot of foreclosures underway. There's a lot more in the pipeline. A lot of people are behind on their mortgages. That's going to, in a few months, be more foreclosures and so on. And that's going to be such a powerful drag on the economy that we won't get any forward momentum until we deal with that. And the current policy approaches are not going to give us that. Secondly, I think, if you look at the income polarization, it's profound. It's greater than it's been at any time since the 1920s. The share of the income going to the top 1% in the United States, and it's worse, it's more concentrated in New York, reached 24% in 1928. It was below 10% throughout the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, the heyday of the middle class in this country. And then in 1980, around the time that Ronald Reagan came in, it started to go up. And now it's back now in 2007 to the 24% level. And so that sort of mirrors what's going on in the concentration of income in New York. I think something has to happen to give us a different policy mix that favors more broad-based wage increases. Now, there's no single policy program to do that. I think in part it's a mindset that has to happen. I don't think we're going to get a sustained recovery until we have a change in wage policy in this country. The expansion that we had, such as it was from 2003 to 2007, was a debt financed expansion. It was in part because of the housing bubble and consumers being loaded up with debt, this wage productivity gap, people weren't getting a fair return for their contribution to productivity growth in the nation or in New York. That's the crux of the problem in my mind, so we have to address that. In terms of...
James, can I ask the other panelists if they have any comments?
I just wanted to go back to his observation of black unemployment. We did see a few years ago, from 2002 to 2007, an improvement in the black employment population ratio. So the number of black men working relative to the population was growing, indicating that there were fewer that had dropped out. But once the recession kicked in New York, then the displacement of black men just took off. Now, I'm not sure what accounts for that, but the numbers in the current population survey are just astounding. I think Frank Riccone from the City Controller's Office, who's looked at this also, has observed that in the case of New York City. Thanks.
Don, have you? Okay, very good. I have a question for James. This goes back to something that Isaac Ehrlich touched on also. James, you raised the topic of income inequality. And last week, the Wall Street Journal reported that over the last year or two, the level of income inequality seems to have gone down because the people at the high end are not earning what they were. And this has obvious implications for New York in terms of our budget.
That was the day before.
Can I ask my question before you start answering?
Okay. I just want to comment on the premise.
But from New York's perspective, is it a good thing or a bad thing when the rich are earning less and income inequality goes down?
The Wall Street Journal ran that story on the day before the income data for 2008 came out. When the data for 2008 came out, there was a story a couple of days later in the Wall Street Journal that said, well, you know, the decline in incomes at the top wasn't quite as severe as what was anticipated, and actually the share of income going to the people at the top had risen a little bit compared to 2007. So even, you know, that's just in the first part of the stock market down here and so on. So it might be that in 2009 it actually declines. If you look at what's the source of the income growth in New York, I think that's what matters, not so much how concentrated is it at the top. The source of the income growth is the productivity of the average worker, and you see this. It's not just in the finance sector where when there's a bubble on Wall Street and a lot of people get big bonuses and tax revenues in New York will do better, and that's a good thing, and we should all be in favor of that. I think it's a problem in that if you look across industries in New York, the average productivity per worker is very high. And in fact, in 14 out of the 19 sectors, New York State ranks first in productivity per worker in New York. And yet our wages, the wage growth in the economy, isn't commensurate with that. So it would be better if we had an economy where wages were rising across the board. And I think that's also what's needed in order to provide the right incentives for people to make the investments in human capital that need to be made.
Why is it? Why? I mean, first of all, is the data good? It's good. Why? It's mystery. Why is there this?
Why is
Why is there what?
Why is productivity not showing up for wages?
Why is productivity not keeping up with wages? We're going to have to keep that for another day. Let me go to the back here, and then we'll move on to our next panel.
Andrew Harvey, New York State Public Service Commission. In looking at the data that was presented today, I would think that a takeaway would be that, gee, New York is not doing all that bad vis-a-vis the national economy. And yet, when you look at GDP forecasts nationally, we're looking at a reduction of 2.6, and yet the New York City Office of Management and Budget is saying that for this year, the gross city product of New York City is going to decline by 12%. That's really a very large number relative to the national economy, and obviously translates down to budgets for governments. I'm just wondering if we're just headed for a major train wreck, given the fact that we've had $14 billion this year to help support the state budget, and maybe it's another 14 next year, and then we're looking at the possibility of another stimulus to maybe bail us out again. I mean, what do the panelists really think about what's happening here when you start looking at the numbers? And does anybody really know where we're at with gross state product at this juncture for 2009?
Don, I know you've looked at the revenue picture for states across the country, and you're pretty well informed about New York in particular. You want to try to answer that?
Sure, let me get us started. A couple of things. I mean, as I think I said, I mean, most of what we've used here today to describe the depth of the recession is employment, which is fine for exactly the purpose we were using it for. But when you think about budgets and finances, you need to think about those things that revenue, when we start thinking about income and the value of production. And so I think it's not surprising that GDP would fall much more sharply. There's been an enormous loss of income, particularly in the financial services sector, as Jim talked about the year-over-year declines expected in wages in New York. They're historically huge, and that's contributed to New York's big budget gaps. And that's one of the reasons. New York, as to whether we're headed for a train wreck, it's clear that there are big budget problems ahead. The state budget office has said they're looking, once the fiscal stimulus money goes away, they're looking at a budget gap of about $18 billion, which is 24% roughly of the general fund. So the answer is there is a very big problem still facing the state, and it's going to be 3-4 more years to work its way out of it.
Right. I think the city projection was probably done back at the end of April because it was incorporated in the mayor's executive budget, and I don't think it changed with the adopted budget. That was around the time the state labor department did this projection on what job loss would be in the finance sector. And I'm not saying that things are fine in this Wall Street part of it. In the banking sector, commercial banking, it's very curious to me. When you look at the employment numbers in New York City, there's been no decline in employment over the past 12 months. How is that possible? You answer the question. In the Wall Street sector, the decline, I think, is severe, but it didn't fall off a cliff as was expected. And again, that small consolation, it's still very bad. Don't get me wrong. The New York economy, there's no way to sugarcoat it. It's still very bad. It's worse in other places. And because it's worse in other places, I'm optimistic that there will be another round of stimulus, which I think is essential because I don't think that the U.S. economy, given what's going on right now, can generate a sustainable recovery. I think there's going to be a positive number for third quarter GDP, but a lot of that is due to the stimulus. The stimulus had a powerful effect in the second quarter in keeping the decline in GDP at like 0.1%, rather than there was a 5% decline in wages in the second quarter, and yet the stimulus package contributed to a 5% increase in disposable personal income. That had a lot to do with the GDP numbers not looking as bad as they did. I think we have a long way to go to get out of this, and it's going to take more government investment in the economy.
Irene?
Yes, and I would hope that the next stimulus package devotes more to state and local government. Here is a case where there are people on the verge of layoff. It is so easy to get money into the hands of people by giving funds to state and local employees. And rather than having to build roads and bridges, which have a much longer lead time, putting money into the hands of state and local employees to me is just a no-brainer as far as a way of keeping the unemployment rate from falling further.
Any state and local employees here who want to second that motion? Well, on that note, we will thank our panelists.